Hi, I'm John Stevenson. We're going to be looking at the Phoenicians in our continuing study of world civilizations. For our study of the Phoenicians, we begin in the what's called the Levant, the far eastern side of the Mediterranean. So we're going to zoom in on that. And here we notice to the north of Canaan, the area right along the coast is the area of the Phoenician settlements. The Phoenicians are going to be settled here. The term Phoenicians comes from the Greek word Phoeniki. Um, it's what the Greeks referred to them. It's how they described them. The Phoenicians probably did not call themselves that, unless it was much, much later where they borrowed the term. Just like if I go to Mexico, I might be described as a gringo. And after a while, I might even call myself by that name. Now, the Phoenicians were a branch of the Canaanites, so they were a subset of the Canaanite peoples. Both their language and we're going to see later on their writing are going to be adapted from the Canaanites. They settled along the coast, and when you go to the north there, one of the things that you see in that area are the cedars of Lebanon. Um, in fact, Lebanon, that's a modern day designation for that, but it's also an ancient designation for that area. And the great tall cedar trees are going to be perfect for the building of ships. And so this is going to lead them into maritime, that is, ocean going ventures. And that puts them in contrast with the Jews. The Jewish people were can I say it nicely? They were a whole race of what we would call landlubbers. They hardly ever went out to sea or even in boats. Think about this. In the Bible, every time you see a Jewish person getting into a boat, it's always a disaster. The disciples on the Sea of Galilee, and Sea of Galilee is that little tiny lake. They refer to that as a sea. And that's because there are no natural harbors along Canaan. But as you go further north, you do find some harbors and even some islands that are set up with their own natural harbors in place. And so the Phoenicians are going to make use of that. Earlier in history, it had been the Minoans who had been the rulers of the sea. But when the Minoan civilization falls, then the Phoenicians now will take over as the greatest ocean-going people, first in the Mediterranean, but eventually throughout the entire Middle East. And so the development of their ships is going to be classic. Did they get their knowledge from the Minoans? Perhaps they did. I can't really say where they got it from. But notice, and this is one of their later ships. Notice the beams go end to end. We've actually found um, an old boat that was sunk in the Sea of Galilee. And instead of the planks going from end to end, they go around the circumference. Not quite so seaworthy, doesn't have quite the same. Notice the keel that's on here. That is the center point of the boat that goes around the bottom and all the way to the other end. The boats that were on the Sea of Galilee, at least the one we found, did not have that outfitted, which doesn't make it quite as seaworthy. The other thing that the Phoenicians did very early on, they came up with an alphabet. Notice the date here is 1250 BC. Now, in more recent times, we have found, you say, where did the Phoenicians get it from? Perhaps they got it from Egypt, but we have found some alphabet writings in the Sinai dating to a much earlier period, as early as maybe 1700 BC. And that suggests maybe can I suggest maybe the Phoenicians got it from the Jewish people? Maybe. We don't know. But their alphabets look very much the same. Now, the advantage of writing with an alphabet, as opposed to the Mesopotamian cuneiform or the Egyptian hieroglyphs, is that you can get by on maybe 22, 24, 26 letters. Much, much, much less than the cuneiform in Mesopotamia or the hieroglyphs in ancient Egypt. And so now this might have been modified slightly from both the cuneiform and from probably more from the Egyptian hieroglyphs, but this makes it so much easier to write. and it makes it easier for the archaeologists to interpret, to sort of break the code of the language and to begin to read it. As you notice, by the way, and you read both Phoenician as well as Hebrew from right to left instead of left to right. So the upper right-hand corner, notice the Aleph. Actually, if you use your imagination, it looks a little bit like an ox. And it just so happens that Aleph is the both Hebrew and I'm going to guess, I don't speak Phoenician, but I'm going to guess maybe the Phoenician word as well for ox. And likewise, Beth, Gimel, Dalet, and so on. And so these started out, the letters actually began as sort of loose pictures, but then gradually, probably taking the sound that the word makes, those became known. Those became sound devices, like our alphabet. You know, even today we say A is for apple. Now, an A doesn't look anything like an apple, so that doesn't really help. But it did help them to learn their alphabet. And so we have the Phoenicians, a number of cities. Now, the Egyptian period, beginning from around 1500 down to 1200 BC, is a period where, for the most part, Egypt is dominating. And when I say dominating, they're not going in and ruling over the Phoenician cities. And notice you have Tyre and Sidon, or as you might pronounce it, Sidon and Byblos, and then cities that were actually in part of Canaan, Dor and Joppa, but probably started out as Phoenician cities as well. Well, the Egyptians did come in and conquer those places, but they set up trading alliances where were the kings of these cities, and there wasn't a Phoenician empire. Rather, you had individual city states, and each city had its own king. And these kings would trade with Egypt and maybe give presents to Egypt for the sake of Egypt not messing with them. And so they were semi-independent, and yet Egypt had quite a bit of influence during this period. Now, timber was often transported down to Egypt, those big cedars of Lebanon. There was not an inexhaustible supply, and yet some could be taken and transported to Egypt, where see in Egypt, you don't have a lot in the way of nice big trees, of good wood. So instead, the pharaohs would used to use many of these things from the Phoenicians. However, the Egyptians eventually come into conflict with the Hittites to the north, and they almost sort of cancel each other out, again, leaving the Phoenicians eventually to their own devices to grow as independent city-states. Thus, around 1200 BC, we have the Iron Age, and from this time on, Egypt is going to stay in Egypt. We're not going to see too many Egyptian incursions outside. We'll see the occasional one, but the Egyptians, for the most part, won't be bothering the Phoenicians. And likewise, the Hittites, their civilization actually collapses, and so both of those bigger empires, those bigger neighbors, they go into decline. And now we see the Phoenicians begin to rise in their ascendancy. We had already said we had the decline of the Minoans, and really it's around the same time. Actually, they had declined earlier, but by 1200 BC, we see the end of any Minoan influence. And it's now that the Phoenicians begin to plant colonies, slowly at first, but eventually throughout the Mediterranean. And we're going to look at some of those colonies in just a bit. Now, it's also just a bit after this, around 1000 BC, that we have the Phoenicians entering into treaties, into covenants with both King David and later on with his son, King Solomon. And you'll remember the story about how David wants to build a house for the Lord, and God says, well, no, your son can do that. But David is actually putting together the supplies that will eventually be brought down to Jerusalem. And for those supplies, he goes to Hiram, the king of Tyre, and agrees that they will bring down big giant logs, cedars of Lebanon, that will be moved by sea and then from the coast uphill to Jerusalem in order to build the temple and to build eventually Solomon's palace. Most of those things are going to be built with wood. You say, well, why wood? Why not stone? Why not marble? Because wood was considered a much more valuable commodity in that day. And so we have this negotiation into which they enter. In fact, we even read that Solomon has fleets of ships set up in the Red Sea, presumably staffed by Phoenician sailors, and that he's going to send his ships to the south as well, down to the areas south of Arabia, maybe even as far as Africa, in order to procure trade elements from those far off areas. Now I want to talk a bit about the Phoenician religion. It was similar to the Canaanite beliefs, and as such, they engaged in polytheism. They had a number of different gods. Their gods included El. El was just the word for God. In fact, we have the Jewish counterpart to that. Sometimes in the Bible, you'll see El referred to not as a pagan god, but as the God of the Israelites. Other times, he's referred to the fuller title of Elohim. The im part is just the plural form. In other words, it's you have in Hebrew what's called a plural of majesty when you want to describe something big and glorious. So more often you have the Bible speaking of Elohim, but sometimes, quite a few times, you have just El used to describe God. Well, El was the chief god of the Phoenicians, and the word just means God. And then you had his son Baal. Now, Baal technically means Lord, so it was the son of El, but also you'll see Baal even used of husbands. If you go to Israel today and a woman wants to introduce her husband, she might refer to him as her Baal because that's the word for husband or Lord. Um, and there's even one or two places where Baal is used not just of the pagan deity, but even of God, because it's the basic word for Lord. So there was El, and there was Baal, and then there was Melkart, who was actually one of the gods of one of the cities, and a whole host of others. I'm not going to go through all the various names. But Baal is going to be mentioned quite a number of times in the Bible, and so I want to note that. And the statue that you see here on the right is supposed to be the god Baal. Now, their religious practices included sacrifice to these pagan gods and worship with them. Sometimes it also included what you could only describe as temple prostitution, where they would engage in various sexual acts in order to entice the god to bring fertility to the land. And if that sounds twisted, it really was. Indeed, one of the things that they would do at the Tophet, at the special altar, they would oftentimes give a sacrifice of their child, and they would take this baby and throw it into the fire, again, in order to excite the god and appease the god and have fertility to come into the land. And the book of Jeremiah talks about that terrible practice, which in some cases the Jews even tried their hand at some of that, copying their neighbors. Well, where would they get such an idea? Well, the idea comes because in Israel's day, after David, after Solomon, after the breakup of the kingdom of Israel in the north and Judah in the south, one of the kings of Israel, Omri, wanted to enter into an alliance with his neighborhood king from Sidon, Ethbaal, also known as Etobaal, uh, and they arranged a marriage between their children. This was to form the basis of the alliance, and so Jezebel, the Sidonian Phoenician queen, was married to Ahab, who was next in line to become king of Israel. And this Jezebel Ahab story is, of course, Elijah comes on the scene and says, you shouldn't be worshiping these pagan gods, because Jezebel had brought with her not only pagan gods, but pagan priests and this paganism entered the land. Now, Israel had already had issues with using idols sometimes to worship God, and that was wrong. But this was even worse because now they were turning away from God to worship this pagan god of Baal. And then, if matters could go even worse, Jezebel and Ahab have a number of children. Some become kings of Israel, but one of them, Athaliah, enters into a marital alliance with the king of Judah and is actually married to the king of Judah. And so she takes this Baal worship down to Judah as well, and it spreads throughout the land. Now, at a later date, we have the Egyptians being hired by Pharaoh Necho around 600 BC. Pharaoh Necho was one of the later Egyptian pharaohs, long after David and Solomon and even Ahab that we mentioned a little while earlier. And we're told that Pharaoh Necho had hired these Phoenician sailors to circumnavigate Africa. They were going to make a circuit around Africa. Accordingly, the story goes that they sailed south from the Red Sea and continued on the way. Now, the story is told to us by the Greek historian Herodotus. And as Herodotus tells us the story, he says he doesn't actually believe it. He's relating the story the way he heard it from the Egyptians, but he says that's got to be silly because the way they tell the story, as they continued around Africa, they found that the sun began to rise on their right hand instead of their left hand, and that's a silly thing. The sun wouldn't change. Well, wait a minute. We know that if they're really circumnavigating Africa, then there would come a point once they passed the Cape of Good Hope and moved into the Atlantic Ocean, that indeed the sun would begin to rise on the right. So the very reason that Herodotus has for rejecting the story is our reason for maybe giving it a bit more credence. Shortly, still in the days of Pharaoh Necho, Nebuchadnezzar comes to the city of Tyre, and he besieges the city of Tyre and captures the mainland city. Of course, Tyre was set up on both on the mainland, but off the coast there was an island with a harbor built in. And as seen in our picture, Nebuchadnezzar was able to capture the mainland, but could not capture the island because Babylonians don't have a lot in the way of ships. And by this time, the Phoenicians were the masters of the ocean. And yet it was a bit later in the late 300s. Now, late 300s is in the low 300s because remember BC, the numbers are going backwards. So in 332, Alexander the Great, that Macedonian general, also comes to Tyre, and he lays siege to the city. And the Phoenicians are still masters of the ocean, and so they think, well, if he can't reach us out here, Alexander fools them. He actually builds a causeway all the way out, half mile out to the island, and captures the city and destroys the city. After this, Tyre becomes sort of a nothing place, just a fishing village, and breaks the back of the Phoenicians, at least with regard to Tyre. But by this time, a great many of the Phoenicians had moved westward. And so we see by this time, notice the time again is around the time of Alexander, no longer are the Phoenicians so much in control of the cities of Sidon and Byblos and Tyre, but they have moved westward to places like Carthage, and notice southern Spain and parts of Sicily, and also Sardinia and Corsica, those islands to the west of Italy. And it's while they are here that the Phoenicians are going to come in conflict, not with Alexander. He'll never reach out that far to the west. But instead, we're going to have Carthage coming into conflict with Rome in three what are called Punic Wars. Now, that word Punic, again, just means Phoenician. And so you have three wars, one in 264 to 241, the First Punic War, the second from 218 to 201, the third from 149 to 146. And in all three of these wars, Rome is successful. And the influence of the Phoenicians in Carthage was their chief city in the west, grows less and less and less. And finally, in that Third Punic War, Carthage is destroyed, and the Phoenicians have ceased to exist as a superpower or even really as a second-rate power. Now, that doesn't mean all the Phoenician people have disappeared. They're still around. Indeed, by the time we get to the New Testament, we see an interesting story making reference to a Phoenician. In Mark chapter 7, verses 24, beginning in verse 24, we read that Jesus got up and went away from there to the region of Tyre. Notice he doesn't necessarily go to Tyre, but to that general region. And when he had entered a house, he wanted no one to know of it, yet he could not escape notice. But after hearing of him, a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit immediately came and fell at his feet. Now here's Jesus. He's actually left He's left the promised land. He's left Israel, and he's gone up to the region of Tyre, um, sort of on, I guess we could call it vacation, taking a break from things. And this woman seeks him out. Verse 26, now the woman was a Gentile of the Syro-Phoenician race. Now you say Syro-Phoenician, what's that? That area, what we call Syria, had originally been called Aram, but the Romans had changed the name to Syria, and so she's Syro-Phoenician, sort of an amalgamation of people from that area. So she's part Phoenician, and she kept asking him to cast the demon out of her daughter. And he was saying to her, let the children be satisfied first, for it is not good to take the children's bread and throw it to dogs. Now, what Jesus says, there's no nice way to put it. It's rather insulting. I think perhaps maybe his expression, and maybe the fact that when he refers to the dogs, he actually uses the diminutive. You could almost translate this puppies. I think that might be going a bit too far. But still, those are harsh words, because the Jews would refer to the pagans, and especially to the pagans like former Canaanites and Syro-Phoenicians. They would refer to them as dogs because of their pagan worship. And yet here's one who was coming to Jesus. And she answered and said, yes, Lord. Notice she doesn't disagree with Jesus. She doesn't say, how dare you say such a thing to me? Instead, she accepts his words, and then she bargains with him. But even the dogs under the table feed on the children's crumbs. Perhaps I can get not what I deserve, but just a hand-me-down, just a bit of grace. And Jesus responds to her request for grace with grace. And so he says in verse 29, he said to her, because of this answer, go, the demon has gone out of your daughter. And going back to her home, she found the child lying on the bed, the demon having left. You see, there's a promise even for nasty old Phoenicians, those who had a legacy of idolatry and wickedness, and yet could find salvation in the hands of Jesus.